Today's talk is on not misusing intoxicants. So today's talk is on not misusing intoxicants. This is a continuation of a series on the Soto Zen Bodhisattva precepts we've been talking about. You may recall we talked about not killing, not stealing, not misusing sexuality, not lying. And today we reach the fifth precept, which is not to misuse intoxicants. This precept in the traditional Soto Zen language actually says, I vow not to deal in intoxicants. Whatever exactly that means, I guess it means not to sell them, but not to deal in them. It's an interesting way of putting it. But this is generally understood by people in the Buddhist tradition of not misusing intoxicants. And in many traditions, it's not to use intoxicants at all. Although the truth is we can never completely avoid using intoxicants if we have a more spacious version of what that means. Just like any of the other precepts. You know, we can vow not to kill and not to steal, and inevitably we do. And again, as I've said before, it's this engagement with the precepts that makes them so rich. So I'd like to approach today's precept with that same lens. Not from a black and white, don't do this, but how can we engage with this precept in a meaningful way and really let it inform how we live our lives and how we really open our practice. So not misusing intoxicants. What is that? What does that mean? So again, as with the other precepts, there's a very sort of black and white side, which is, I just said, is not always black and white either. I vow not to misuse intoxicants. And then there can be a very spacious interpretation of this. And there's that range is what gives us the way to engage with it. Today I wanted to start with the way that the Zen teacher Norman Fisher talks about this. I liked his presentation, and I like the way that he engages with it, because he says that intoxication, so he goes to intoxication rather than intoxicants, the items. Intoxication is an act of avoidance. And that would be my central question for you today. What are you avoiding in life? Or what are you trying to avoid? Because inevitably we cannot avoid it. So what are we trying to avoid through the use of intoxicants? And intoxicants could mean many things. Obviously alcohol, drugs, marijuana, but then keep stretching. What else helps us to avoid things in our life? TV, binge watching Netflix. So many different things. Even our own practice can sometimes be an act of avoidance. This is what intoxication is. Intoxication is an act of avoidance. Refusing to face what is by covering it with something else. And when doing this, we hope that things will be more pleasant. This is really easy to see with alcohol. For those of you who sometimes have a drink, if you really are paying attention. So think of that day where you've come home from work and you've had a really hellish day. And then maybe your commute home was even worse. Maybe it was a heat wave and maybe you just really are at your limit. And you get home, and the first thing you want to do is just, had such a rotten day, I just want to have a drink. So that impulse is very human and very natural. And having that drink is a way of relaxing, a way of, I'm finished, I'm letting go. It can also be a signal for many people that their workday is finished and letting it go. That act, that ritual act in the middle. So what I'm cautioning about here is not so much the ritual or the drink itself, but the question, are you avoiding something? And if so, what harm does that cause, if any? As Zen practitioners, we really focus on showing up to our life. And as we all know, sometimes our life is hard. Sometimes the things that come up for us are so hard. It's very human and very natural to want to avoid those at times. But whatever happens, whatever functions in our life to sort of blunt our awareness actually prevents us from experiencing what is. And Zen practice is about experiencing what is. The things we like, the things we don't like, the things that make us happy, the things that are painful, and really cultivating the ability to be present to what is. So again, it's not so much about the drink as it is about the act of avoidance. What are we avoiding? What are we avoiding? More often than not, it's pain, of course, suffering. The first noble truth, suffering exists. We suffer. But what is the second noble truth? We suffer because we hold on. The avoidance, I just said avoidance. The release of suffering is possible by letting go. And there's a path for that. It's the Buddhist path. We suffer as humans, we suffer. We suffer because we want things to be different than they are. The cessation of suffering is possible. Letting go and following the path. Wanting things to be different than they are is the cause of suffering. So that brings us to another way of seeing that impulse, that need for that drink when we get home. Do I want things to be different than they are? Hell yeah, I do. This is an awful day. I've had a terrible day. I want them to be different than they are. I'd like to suggest that there are other ways to transition. Again, not going so much into the drink itself as the avoidance of what is. Maybe we could spend a few days, we get home, sitting outside. If we have a yard, sitting in the yard. If we have a window, just sitting next to the window and letting go of our day that way. We can do that, When I was working at a big hospital in New York City, I saw some really difficult things, working in end-of-life care. So I would cultivate the intention to let go of it on my ride home. I'd ride my bicycle home. And especially as I got to the river, to cross the river from Manhattan over into Brooklyn, I would envision just really releasing those difficult things with a wish for all beings to be happy and free from suffering as I cross the river. That's a cultivation of something that can benefit rather than harm us. All of us want to be happy and don't want to suffer. This is a basic, premise of human life. We all want to be happy and we don't want to suffer. What holds us back from being happy and not suffering? If we are avoiding, then we're not facing what it is that's the source of our suffering. So I'm encouraging you to try out not avoiding. And if using intoxicants is part of your strategy for avoidance, then let's look at that. What other ways do we use intoxicants? Well, connection is one. And we've talked about that with some of the other precepts. Alcohol gives us a way to connect, with our work colleagues, or, if we've been bickering with our spouse and we're like, can we just let this go? Let's have a drink and just sit for a while. Sometimes it lets us let down those barriers that we put up. And that can be, letting down the barriers can be a good thing. In Japan, that system is even codified. They have actual terms for it, and it's necessary in your working environment to go out for drinks with your colleagues. And the reason is the effect, I guess, is it lets you let down your work persona and let down your guard about the things that you can't say. And with the influence of alcohol, say those things that are not usually said. Act in that way that you don't usually let out. And in doing so, you get to see a little window into people's inside person, inner self. Such a treasure. They have these names for it even. Outside person, tatemai, and inside person, honne. What if we could share that connection inside person? I don't mean just like throw away all boundaries, but what if we could share our true heart with each other without needing something to help us do that? I think we're all capable of that. And our practice is a really great way to help us do that. It can be kind of scary sharing our vulnerabilities with others, sharing our deepest desires or fears or sadnesses. And yet we know that doing so really brings us into a oneness with others. So is it possible to get past this barrier of fear? What if they don't like me? Oh, I don't know if they're ready to hear this. Is it possible to get past this without the use of an outside crutch, of an intoxicant? And I think it is. But it takes bravery and it takes cultivation of the ability to stay present. And if we are using intoxicants to take us out of the present, then they're acting as an exact opposite of what our real intention is. And this is the danger. Sometimes we use intoxicants when we have something difficult to talk about. Maybe we don't do it intentionally, or maybe we do. That thing that we've been wanting to say for quite a while. Don't quite know how to do it skillfully. Don't quite know how to bring it up. But that night that we have a few beers, all of a sudden it comes out. Look at that. What a relief. But is it? if it's not still in line with the principles of right speech? What if we just said it a little too bluntly? What if we hurt somebody accidentally in the way that we said it, even though we needed to say it? So again, I'm arguing that there are other ways. And that in this case, the use of intoxicants may even cause more harm. And as you may recall, all of the precepts are related to each other. You know, if using intoxicants, we break one of the other precepts, then they take us out of the connection that we really need. And on the other side of it, if we're not sure about this one precept, I vow not to misuse intoxicants, we can look to the other precepts to give us additional information. How might that work? Okay, I said I was going to share a story, so let's share a story. So hold on just a minute. The story I heard by Yangtze Rinpoche, who was a Tibetan teacher that I worked with in Oregon. And he tells this story. And this story is, I think it's a traditional story. I don't think it's his unique story. So it's a story highlighting the significance of the fifth precept. And the fifth precept is the precept of not to misuse intoxicants. So here's the story. So there was once a monk living in the mountain in a cave, practicing meditation. He had a benefactor down at the base of the mountain, and she'd bring up food sometimes, you know, make sure he's doing okay, take good care of him, which is great. So the benefactor had a beautiful daughter. I mean, this often happens in these stories, but bear with me. So he had a beautiful daughter who would bring the supplies up to the monk, up the mountain, and drop off the food or whatever other supplies she might have been bringing to support him in his practice. But over time, the daughter fell in love with the monk. Like, oh, he's so great. He's always so kind. I just wish he wasn't celibate. It would be so great. And so she fell in love with him. And so she suggested to the monk that they should get married. So the monk was really shocked. Like, no, I couldn't possibly marry you. Ugh, I'm a celibate monk. I am sorry. She's really sad. She goes back down the mountain. The next time she comes up the mountain, she brings a goat and offers it to the monk. And then she says, well, you know, what if we slaughter the goat and have a feast together? And then the monk was like, oh no, I couldn't do that. I'm a Buddhist monk, and you know, I can't kill a living being, you know. So then she goes back down the mountain. The next time she comes back with a jug of chang, which is Tibetan beer. And she's like, okay, fine. You can't marry me. I get that you're celibate. And you can't kill a living being. But, I mean, just have a little chang, you know, like, surely you can drink. That one's not such a big deal. So then the monk thinks about it, and he was like, okay, so the fifth precept is the least important one. So, it's not so harmful, you know, really. It's not a big deal. So the least of the five precepts, the least harmful of those would be to drink the beer. So he said, okay, let's drink it together. And so they did. So they drank the beer, or chang. And then what happens? Well, monk gets drunk, right? In the process, he breaks the third precept, celibacy for monks. And then they get hungry. And then what? He sees a chicken in the neighbor's yard, goes over to the neighbor's yard, steals the chicken, kills the chicken, eats the chicken. And by the time all of this happens, the neighbor comes over. have you seen my chicken? And the monk's like, I haven't seen your chicken. All 5 precepts got broken at once. So Tibetan saying, first a person takes the bottle, then the bottle takes a bottle, and finally the bottle takes a person. So it's kind of, it's maybe easier to see the danger in the first 4 precepts, but when we see them as all related to each other, we can start to understand how harm can come up. And I really, I've seen this a lot. I've seen this sometimes in the monasteries. Sometimes at the end of a long period of training or at the end of a big ceremony, there is beer offered, especially in Japan, where it's very culturally expected to have a beer. And if another precept is going to be broken, this is a very opportune time for it to happen. And it does happen. And there are regrets. And people do break precepts and wake up the next day feeling awful and feeling out of alignment with their basic vows. So the danger is not so much in the don't do this. It's more what's going on. And by the time we break one precept, we've opened the door for many of the others to be broken as well. So I'm going to talk about that for a couple of minutes. For example, drinking. We all know about drunk driving, right? Why is drunk driving bad? Not necessarily because of ourselves, which it certainly could be harmful to myself if I kill myself, which isn't going to allow me to continue my practice for the benefit of all beings. But I could accidentally kill someone else. And maybe not only just a person, but, when your response time is lower, you could hit an animal, deer, somebody's kitty, and then you feel terrible, right? So alcohol can lead to killing, and not just of things, but, it can lead to killing of our dreams or our ideas, including our dream of practice. We can start going down that hole of, I don't know why I'm doing this. There's no point. It's so hard. It really can suck us in. So misusing intoxicants can lead to killing, to stealing. Alcohol or other intoxicants can make us less attuned to the needs of others. I think we've seen or experienced this, where you kind of become a little extra self-focused and forget about the other people. And alcohol certainly does this. Other drugs do too. Think of cocaine. It's such a opposite of practice kind of a drug, where people become so hyper-focused on themselves that they literally forget there's anybody else in the world. So being less focused on the needs of others and more focused on ourselves leads us to really getting out of that contentment of not stealing. Remember when I talked about stealing? I talked about contentment and cultivating that, getting out of the mode of not enough and more into the mode of being okay with what is. So it can lead to that. And then just, there's that donut that you want to steal too. Not to make it too philosophical. Sexuality, I just talked about. We want to feel more connected. We like being connected with others, but sometimes our judgment is impaired when we've had too much to drink. And that very connection we need so badly becomes a bad connection. There are ways we can connect without needing that extra. And there are ways that we can misuse sexuality under the use of intoxicants that can really cause harm. Can really, not just definitely rape, definitely sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and also just bad encounter that hurts another person. And what about lies? I spoke a little bit about lies. I mean, we might say, okay, I won't lie, but think of the kind of lies that you might do while using intoxicants. Remember I talked about 4 kinds of lying. Lying, I'm not sure what just happened. Yeah. I talked about 4 kinds of lying. Lying, exaggerating, saying one thing to one person and another thing to another person, and using insulting or abusive language. So even if we don't lie per se, how many of you have ever exaggerated when you've had a drink? Or said one thing to one person and something else to someone else? Or found it a little easier to use insulting or abusive language? The alcohol or other intoxicants contribute to that. And finally, just the use of alcohol to mask our pain can lead us to using more alcohol or more intoxicants, whether it's marijuana or different drugs or even our own practice. So the central question here is, how can we face our own suffering and not avoid our own suffering? We can even use our own practice as an intoxicant. When we really start craving the practice that feels blissful and become averse to the aspects of practice that are painful. This is also avoidance. And if our own practice becomes an intoxicant, wanting only that feels great and blissful and not wanting that's more difficult, then this is also a misuse of an intoxicant. Not that our practice is inherently an intoxicant, but we make it one. So as you can see, all of the precepts are connected with each other. They're really one, as one practice. So that's what I would like to share with you today. Do not misuse intoxicants. In other words, do not use intoxicants as an act of avoidance. Be present to what is in this moment with the support of the Buddha's teachings and the practice of the Buddhas and ancestors, including all of us here throughout space and time. We can do this together and find that there's no need to avoid. It can be so rich to remain present. Thank you.